So today we are going through two samples. These are going to be the first two samples for notebook 2. And it's going to be 2 in 1. So we'll do two separate techniques, but they're all going to end up stitched into the same sample by the end of it. And I'll try and differentiate between those two as we go. These are the pattern pieces that you're going to need for today, and these are already uploaded on Blackboard. So I've got a front bodice, and this one I had to paste together. It was 4 separate pieces. So that front bodice, and then one thing that is hard to tell on here, but there's a notch right at center front on the neckline, where you get it pasted together. That's why it kind of just blends into that line. So make sure that you actually notch that neckline right at center front. So we have front bodice, we have back bodice, and this one should have a double notch at the top. I think I forgot to put it there, so we can just add that little double notch right at center back as well. And I'm going to go ahead and do that so you can see. So right on either side of that line where I pasted them together, I'm just going to do a little snip about 1/4 inch away from the line. Okay, so that back bodice, and then we've got a front facing, and it's an all-in-one facing, so it will be pasted together. And again, this one has that center front notch at the neckline and at the bottom of the piece. So at either side of this line where you paste it together, make sure that you snip into the fabric and you just do a single notch on either side. Just like that. Okay, front facing, and we have a fusing piece to go with that. And then back facing, and this one does have the double notch on it. I did not forget at that time, so you have double notch on top and bottom. And then a fusing piece to go with that. And then we've got our lining. So we should have a front lining. Again, there's a single notch right where that gets pasted together at the very top of that line. And then a back lining with a double notch at the top. So make sure that you get all of those properly notched before you get started. Okay, so today we are doing an all-in-one facing with lining attached. So those are the two separate techniques that we're doing. We're learning how to attach lining to the inside of a garment, and then we're learning how to put our facing onto the garment with that lining attached. So we're going to start with our bodice pieces. Actually, before we do that, we need to fuse. So let's start with our fusing pieces, our facing. This is my back facing with the fusing piece that goes with it. I need to turn it onto the back, lay that out, and then glue side down, put my fusible interfacing on there. We'll interface all these pieces, and then we'll get started on the actual sewing. So here's the back, and then you'll have a front facing as well. Double check that all of that truly adhered together before you move on. Okay, I'm going to set that aside for a moment. Let me get my front one fused. Okay, so both of those are fused. I can set both of those aside, and we're going to work with our bodice pieces first. So the first technique that we're going to complete is our lining, but again, these kind of intertwine with each other, these two techniques, which is why we're doing 2 in 1. They will kind of intertwine with each other, but these first steps that I will talk to you about will include on your lining. Whenever you fill out your notebook, you can include it on your lining instructions. And then I'll tell you at which point we'll switch over and we'll start doing instructions for your facing sample. Okay, so let's get our bodice front and bodice back first. And we're going to put those right sides together. And we're going to attach them at the shoulders and the side seams. And you'll see your front one is a little bit more narrow than your back. That is okay. The front and back of your body are not the exact same size. So that's why we have that difference. But I'm going to match them up on the side seam. And then I'll work my way around and do the shoulders and the other side seam as well. And then other side seam. Okay, we're gonna go stitch all of these at 1/2 inch. So these are considered exposed seams. So they will be 1/2 inch width. Okay, let's go stitch those on our machine. So I just picked a side seam and I'm starting from the hem, working my way up. It doesn't matter if you start from the hem and work your way up or if you start from the armhole and work your way down, as long as you're stitching it at that 1/2 inch. So that's one side seam, and then I'm just going to work my way around. This is what my first shoulder. My other shoulder. And then my other side seam. Okay, let's head to our ironing board. Okay, so trim up any of your threads that you have hanging off before you move on. And then the next thing we're going to do is bust open all 4 of these seams. So if you have something that you can stick up in there, you can use that, or you can just try and lay it flat on the table and bust it open and press it flat. So this is one side seam. My other side seam. Just kind of like what I did with the pants, I'm just kind of flattening it out to where that seam is right in the center. And the fabric that's laying underneath it is flat as well, so that I'm not accidentally pressing creases anywhere that I don't want to. And then for my shoulders, I'm going to try and offset it a little bit. Let's see. I'm just going to go straight through the center. So the rest of my garment's kind of stuck up around it, but that shoulder is flat on the table. If you have an ironing board that gets more narrow towards one end, then you can stick it on that narrow end so that you're only ironing through that layer and there's no fabric underneath. There's one shoulder. Now my other shoulder. And one thing that I didn't mention as I was showing you all of the pieces, you'll notice for mine, my facing pieces are a different cotton color. And that's just so that it's easier to see on camera what's going on. All of your facing and bodice pieces can be the same fabric for your sample if you just have one print of fabric at home. So these are my facing pieces. I just did 2 separate colors, so it's easier to see on camera. Yours can match though. And if it was on a real garment, like when we do our dress, they would match. You would want them to match perfectly. But we will do it here so that you can understand what's happening today. Okay, so we've got a full shirt now. We're gonna go ahead and set that aside, and we're gonna get our facings and lining ready to go inside the garment. So the next thing I'm gonna do is grab my facings and my lining. So this is my front facing. I'm gonna go ahead and grab my front lining. And whenever you set these out, you'll notice they have this matching curve here, right here. So that is where they are going to get attached together. This lining finishes off that inside of our garment. And when we sew those together, you'll see it looks like the same shape as my front bodice. So essentially what we're doing is we're creating a shell, which is our actual fabric that our garment is made out of. That's called your shell. And then you have your inner layer, which is your facing and your lining. They will be the same shape by the time we're done. And then we'll attach those two together so that we have like a shirt within a shirt, essentially. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is attach this lining to this facing. I want them right sides together. So I'm gonna flip this up. I usually start pinning at this center point right here. There's a notch right there at center front, and then work my way out to the edge. You'll notice when we flip those and put them right sides together, you now have these opposing curves that we're going to have to pin together. So I'm going to talk you through a technique to pin those and stitch those to where you're getting those curves to come together and match. So right here at center front, there's a notch. I'm going to put those two together. I'm going to flip this upside down just because it's a bit easier to pin that way. Pin it right at that center front notch. And then I'm going to do the rest of my reference points and we'll come back and pin in between. So this curve needs to come up and match that edge of the cotton. Right at the center point, there's a single notch that you can match. So I'm just pulling that lining up to the cotton and matching that raw edge. And then the very corner of my facing and lining, I can match those two together. Okay, I'm going to do the same reference points on the other side. So again, this lining needs to come up and match this curve. I'm going to grab it at that midpoint notch and bring it up. Pin, and then do my corner. And now I can go back in between those pins and start matching up that curve. So right here, I've got these first two pins. You can see my opposing curves. I'm going to bring this lining up to the cotton. And the technique that I use to pin is once you bring this up, you'll see your fabric naturally wants to start curving. It's no longer going to lay flat. So you can see from this angle where it's starting to curve. I'm going to use that curve to my advantage. I'm going to bend it over my finger. So that curve is going over my finger, and use that to pin those two together. So you don't have to fight that curve and try to force it flat. And my pins on this one, you'll see, are closer together than normal. Right now, they're maybe an inch apart. At some portions of this, they'll get even closer together. And that's because you have those opposing curves. They're going to want to separate as you sew. So if you don't pin it more often, you may end up getting gaps where they're starting to separate and your raw edges no longer match. So that's one portion. I'm going to move on to the next portion here. On this one, it's curving the opposite direction. So my lining is sticking up higher than my cotton. So I'm going to have to pull my lining down to that cotton fabric and match up those raw edges. Again, curving it over my finger. And I'll show you that from a different angle where I'm curving it over my finger as I pin. Okay. Next portion should be the same as the last because it's just the mirror, the other half of the garment. So again, pull that lining down to the cotton. Curve it over your finger and pin pretty often, pretty close together. See, these are less than half an inch apart, maybe 3/4 of an inch. I'm just readjusting my pins because I had too much fabric in one area, so it didn't get evenly spread somewhere. There we go. Okay, so that's curving over, and you can see where it's naturally starting to kind of curve into a shape. Okay, last little portion. And then we have to pin and do the same thing with our other bodice piece, our back bodice. Okay, so that's my front fully pinned, and you'll see it starts to curve in separate directions. So it'll look like the letter S. Okay. Okay, I'm going to set that aside for a second, and I'm going to do the same with my back bodice. So here's my back facing and my back lining. There's a double notch right here at center back where those should match up. So I'm going to flip that so it's right sides together and start pinning it from that double notch, working out to the edges. Single notch at that halfway point. Same thing over here, single notch at that halfway point, and then match up the corner at the very end. Okay, now going through each section in between those pins to pin it together. Okay, now both of these we're going to go stitch at 1/2 inch. So the edge where the facing gets attached to your lining is typically a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's considered exposed. And then we'll talk about the other edges of your facing later. So this is fully pinned together. When I lay it flat, you can see how it makes that curved shape. Okay, so let's go stitch these together at 1/2 inch. And again, I'm going to talk about a special technique to help avoid getting tucks as you stitch. Okay, so I'm going to stitch with my lining on the bottom. So starting at one of my corners here, and you can see, I'm going to angle this camera so you can see from the side where this naturally wants to start to curve up. So we're gonna, again, work with that curve. When we pinned it, we put lining on top and we curved it down over our finger. But as we're stitching, we're gonna go from the other side and we're gonna curve it up as we feed it into the machine. Okay, so right at that corner, I'm gonna start at that 1/2 inch point, start stitching. And then as I feed it into my machine, instead of laying it flat down to my sewing machine, I'm going to curve it up. So you can see I kind of pick it up. My pointer finger and my thumb are holding this up back here. And then my middle finger is making sure that it's nice and smooth right before it goes under the machine. And I can use that finger to kind of feel for any bumps or tucks that might be forming on the bottom. And then you'll see my other hand come into play in just a minute on the back as it comes out from under the machine. So when it starts coming out back here, I'm going to grab it and I'm going to continue to let it curve up as it comes out. See right here, my edges are separating, so you have to check for that as you go to make sure that your edges stay even. So this technique helps it curve as you're stitching. And again, working with that natural curve, putting that to your advantage and not allowing, if I try and press it flat, it's going to start overlapping on itself on the bottom and tucking. So there's the seam on one piece. This is the side that we stitched from. Double check on the back before you move on that you didn't get any tucks in your fabric on the backhand side. It should be completely smooth along that seam. Ooh, there's one tiny little tuck. So see that where it pleated over on itself? I would want to fix that before I moved on. I'm gonna have to move on without fixing it just because we don't have time today. But that you would want to fix before you move on. So that's what you're looking for, are those little tucks. Okay, let's do the same thing on my other piece. Again, we're stitching from the cotton side and curving it up as we go. So again, check that back side, that lining side, make sure you don't have any tucks. If you do, you can seam rip that area. So if I had one right here, I would seam rip that little area and redo it and smooth it out so that tuck is not there. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board. Okay, so trim your threads before we move on. So again, when I lay that flat, you should see that same shape. Okay, now one at a time, we need to bust open these seams and press them flat. But if I try and do that right now, because they're curved, they are not going to lay flat. I'm gonna have some areas where my fabric is rippling, and that means I have too much fabric. I'm taking a larger curve and pressing it into a smaller space. So that fabric is kind of overlapping on itself and creating bulk. So in those areas where it's kind of ruffling, we need to take out fabric. So we're going to clip those triangles out that remove fabric. And then in these areas where the fabric is smooth, when I try and press that out, it's a smaller curve going into a larger area. And so it doesn't have enough fabric. It needs to spread. So in those areas, we're going to do just a straight clip, and it's going to allow that fabric to spread into that larger area. So I'm going to zoom in a bit for this part so you can see the difference between the ruffle and the flat area. Here we go. So this is probably a good example right here where it's the most visible. You can see where this lining fabric is ruffling because there's too much fabric. When I go to press it flat here, it's going to start tucking over on itself. So we need to remove fabric there. And then on the purple fabric, it's tight. If I try and push it out, it's really taut and it doesn't want to lay flat. So that area, I'm going to just slit and let it spread. So let's go through this for the whole thing. So this is a curve that's facing the opposite direction, and you can see the fabrics are doing the opposite thing from the last one. Purple is ruffling, lining is taut or flat. So on the purple, I'm going to remove by doing those triangles that remove fabric. About every 1/2 inch, I can take out a triangle. And I want the tip of my triangle to go all the way down to where my stitching is, but not through the stitching. Okay, so in that area I removed, and on this side over here, I'm just going to do a slit into the fabric so that it can spread. Yeah, turn it so I have a better angle. And I'm going to do that all the way until it starts ruffling. So over here, it starts ruffling. And I'm going to keep doing my slits until I get to that point. Okay, so now we're on the next curve where it's facing the opposite direction. And again, it's opposite. Lining is ruffling. So here I'm going to take out triangles. And I'm going to do that all the way through this other side because you can see it's still ruffling over here. Okay, and now on the purple side, we need to slit. So I'm going to turn this upside down so it's easier to reach. We need to slit that purple fabric so that it will spread. The tighter the curve, the closer together you can get your slits. So right here where it's a steeper curve, I can slit closer together, maybe 1/4 inch apart. And then right here where it's more shallow, it kind of flattens out. You can do 1/2 inch apart. So I'm doing closer together right here because that's the really steep part. And then as I get to this more shallow part, I can get further. And then again, closer together here because this is steep. The steeper the curve, the closer you want your slits to be. Okay. And then the last curve we have to do is right here. So purple fabric is ruffling. I'm going to take out triangles. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out, and we need to do the same thing on our other piece. So I'm going to zoom out so I can move a little bit faster. But I'm going to grab my other piece, and we're going to do the same clipping technique on this one. And again, you want your clips to go all the way down. So you'll see my clips here. I want them to go down to that stitch line, but not through it. If you don't clip far enough, then it's not achieving what you need, and it's not going to allow it to spread or take away the fabric that you need. Okay, that's my full lining part cut. Now I'm going to do my cotton part. Okay, now we need to press these flat. I'm gonna dust off my area, make a big old mess on my floor, but that's okay. I'll sweep it up later. Excuse me. Okay, so lay that flat on your table, and now you're going to press those busted open. Excuse me. So just bust open each of those little sections of your seam allowance. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like once you've got it fully clipped and pressed. You should see all of those seam allowances spread out, and then nothing should be overlapping each other because we took those triangles out. Our fabric should be laying nice and flat without any overlap. And then from the outside, that seam should be really nice and smooth with no puckers. So if you have areas that are puckering, so see how this is really nice and smooth right here. I have some areas that are puckering a little bit right here. If that's the case, try and press them first. But if those puckers are not coming out with your iron, then what it means is that you need to clip more. So right where that pucker is, right where it's pointing to on your stitch line, you go on the back side and slit your seam allowance right at that point so that it releases that tension, okay? So that's one, and let's press the other one.
Okay, so again, there's my fully pressed seam. And from the front side, I want to check it and make sure that I don't have any puckers. If I do, I can slit in those areas extra on the back side. So that's why we get closer together with our clips on that, on those tight curves. So usually those puckers you can see, like I have one right here that's happening and it's on that steepest part of the curve. So right there, I would go to the other side and just put an extra slit in there to kind of release that tension. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So that was our lining part. That's what I'm going to consider the lining part of our garment. Now from here on out would be the directions for your all-in-one facing. So make sure you separate those when you put them in your notebook. So now we're going to get these two layers and we're going to attach them together. So I've got a front and a back. I'm going to lay them right sides together, just like we did the bodice. And this should look like a front and back bodice, just like we had for our shell fabric, the pink fabric that I'm using. But we're going to go ahead and attach these at our side seam and our shoulders, excuse me, just like we did for the outside of the garment. So when you're pinning your side seam, this seam where the facing gets attached to the lining, it should lay right on top of the other one. So this seam and this seam should lay right on top of each other when you're matching them together. I'll grab my pins. So pin that, match that and pin that first. Then you can match the corners. So this is my armhole corner and this is my hem corner. I'm gonna throw one more pin in there for good measure. And then I'll go match together my shoulders and my other side seam. Okay, so for that other side seam, make sure that seam is right on top of the other one first. Pin those together and then do the corners. Okay, let's go stitch all of those at 1/2 inch again. Okay, so just like I did for the shell, I'm just stitching all 4 of those seams at 1/2 inch. When I cross over that facing seam, I'll show you right here. So this is my facing and lining seam. When I cross over that, I need to make sure it stays busted open on top and bottom. So double check that before you stitch over it. This is one of my shoulders. My other shoulder. And my other side seam. And again, make sure those are both busted open before you cross over. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board again. Okay, trim all of your threads before you move on. And then we're going to bust open all 4 of those seams, just like we did on the shell. And you can see from the other side, those facing seams where the facing is attached to the lining, those should line up right there because you put one on top of the other when you were pinning it. So make sure those are actually matched up. Okay, let's press these shoulders and then we'll move on. So now we have another full shirt, except this one is made out of lining and facing rather than our shell fabric. So now we need to put these 2 together. So I'm going to grab my shell. I'm going to turn it right side out. Here. And then with my lining, I want these right sides together. So I'm going to leave my lining inside out and I'm going to stuff my shell inside. So the right side of the fabric is here on the inside. So when I stuff it, you'll see the right sides are touching each other. So let's take this shell, stuff it inside. You can grab those shoulders and match them up. There we go. So now I've got a shirt within a shirt. And make sure that you're doing this with the front and back matching. So that lower neckline that has a single notch, that's the front. So when you're stuffing one inside the other, make sure you have the fronts together and that you don't accidentally have a front and a back matching. Okay, so the first thing we're going to stitch is this neckline whenever we attach these 2. So we'll stitch this neckline and it's a facing. So we'll do our full 4 steps. We will stitch it and then we will trim, clip, press, and understitch all of those steps to the neckline. And then when we come over to the armhole, it'll be a little bit different process because we won't be able, at that point, we won't be able to just flip our garment inside out. So I'll go over that in more detail in a minute, but the first thing we're going to do is the neckline. So right here at your neckline hole, start matching up those layers. Right at the shoulder seam, they should be one on top of the other. At center front, you should have a single notch to match up. Other shoulder. And then at center back, you should have a double notch to match up. So those are your 4 reference points that you start with. And then you can pin in between and it should match up perfectly. There shouldn't be any ease or any difference in the curve. Okay, and we're going to go stitch those together at 1/4 inch. So let's take those to our machine. Okay, if your arm is skinny enough, you may be able to use your arm at this point. So if I take off this front plate of my machine, I then have a skinny arm to work with. If yours fits, you may be able to put your neckline, slip that arm into your neck hole so that you can rotate it around that arm as you're stitching. That can make it a little bit easier
to make sure that you're not accidentally stitching, that something's not getting caught in there that's not supposed to be. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to start right at a seam. This happens to be my shoulder seam, but you can start at the shoulder or the side. Doesn't really matter, but I usually start at a seam line. And this is going to be 1/4 inch. The edge, the neckline, and the armhole edge of your facing where it gets attached to your garment is considered an enclosed seam. So that one will be 1/4 inch. So everything else we've done so far up to this point was 1/2. Now we're switching down to 1/4. Oh, got a little off there. Sorry. Okay, so connect your stitches from where you start and stop so that you have a full circle. And then we're going to take this back to our ironing board for those 4 steps that we talked about. Okay, so trim up your threads before you move on. And then that first step that we talked about was trimming. So we have to trim our facing seam allowance in half. So the one with the interfacing on it is your facing. And I'm going to trim just that layer. So in my case, that's the purple fabric. Trim just that layer in half. Okay, so we trimmed. Next step is clip. So this is a curve, and we're going to be pressing it from a smaller curve area out towards the facing, which is a larger area. So we need those slits to help it spread as we press it. So I'm going to do those just straight slits about 1/4 inch apart because this is a pretty tight circle. And I want to cut close to my stitch line. So I'll show you here. I want to cut pretty close to my stitch line, but not through it. If you cut through your stitches, you're going to end up with a hole in your neckline. So very carefully, just using the very tip of your shears, cut close to that stitch line, but not through it. And you're clipping through both layers of fabric.
Okay, next thing is press. So we need to press both of these seam allowances to the facing side. So in order to do that, we have to separate our layers. So I'm going to separate my bodice and my lining to where they're sticking off and they're kind of connected at the neck, but they're separated. And then I'm going to turn it inside out so I can look at the inside of it where the seam is. So flip that whole thing inside out. And now right here where the two are connected is my neckline. I'm going to take my ham and I'm going to fill out that neckline with my ham. So I'm going to put it up into one side and pull it on there to where that ham fills out that circle. Okay, and now with it here, I'm going to press both of those seam allowances over to that facing side. And I usually just leave it on the ham and just kind of rotate it around. And now we're going to take this and we're going to understitch. So with it separated just like this, we're going to stitch right next to that original stitch line on top of our seam allowances to hold those down to the facing side. So I'm going to take my ham out, but I'm going to keep it separated just like I have right here. And then when we get to the machine, I'll show you how I put it on there to make sure that I'm stitching in the proper place. Okay, over here, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see what's going on. So that is the arm of my machine. I've still got my two layers separated. I'm going to open up my lining and slip that onto the arm of my machine. And just like we did with the ham, I'm going to let the arm of my machine fill out that neckline. So I know that I'm only stitching right there on that center area where I'm supposed to, and that nothing else is getting caught under there in the way. Okay, so I like to start at a seam again, so I'm just going to rotate around to one of my shoulders. Needle down, and then as I go, you'll see I'm kind of holding those seam allowances over to the facing side so they don't pop up. And then when you get back around to your starting point, just make sure to connect your stitches. Okay, so right here you can see my original stitch line on the left, and then on the right is the understitch, holding those seam allowances down. Okay, back to our ironing board again. Okay, trim up those threads before you move on. Got a thread here on the outside. Okay, and now we're going to turn this right side out again. So flip that whole thing right side out. And then with my shirt here, I'm going to stuff all that lining in through the neckline. So just stuff it into the neckline. And when you shake it out, it should be inside that shirt the proper way. So you can see the right side of the lining on the inside. I shouldn't be seeing any seam allowances right here. Okay, so now we need to press this neckline and then we'll move on to our armhole. So again, I like to use the ham for this part. Slip that on there. So I went all the way into the lining and just stick that ham up into your neckline. And then you want that seam where the facing is attached. You want that seam right on the folded edge. So make sure you pull it all the way out to the edge, but it shouldn't be sticking out. So you notice my facing is purple, but you don't see any of that fabric sticking out from the front because that understitch pulls it to the inside and keeps it on the inside. So seam on the edge, but no facing visible from the outside. We're just going to go around the ham and press that. Okay, so there's our finished neckline. Now we need to do our armhole. This is going to be the complicated part. So there's my finished neckline. On the inside, I should be able to see my facing with my understitch. From the outside, I shouldn't be able to see my facing sticking out at all. Okay, so the armhole is where it gets a bit complicated because we have an all-in-one facing. And what that term refers to, I'll show you this facing. We did a facing last semester that was just on the armhole. And if you remember, it was that kind of J shape that went onto our armhole. Well, we have that shape, but it's also connected to a facing for the neckline, which would be kind of a U shape, and it would cover that neckline. But since we have a narrow shoulder, if we did two separate facings, those would overlap at our shoulder and they would cause extra bulk right there. So instead, they combine them into an all-in-one facing. So that's how it gets its name. And then here they just kind of fill in. So, because if you had separate, let me grab something to draw with. If I had separate facings to where one of them was this J shape and the other one is this U shape here, it would overlap at the corner, at the shoulder, and then it would come up into this sharp corner. And we don't want to sew our lining on at that sharp corner. So instead, what they do is just fill out that space and make it a nice smooth line for you to sew on when you're putting your lining in. So right now, the other thing that complicates the shoulder is we create a tube at the shoulder. So we're going to have this neckline finished and attached to our garment. If we also attach this to our garment, we're creating kind of like a tube right here at the shoulder. And if you do it the same way that you did the neckline, then it will never turn right side out because that tube will kind of just be like an infinity loop. And it will always loop through itself and it will never fully turn right side out. So we have to approach the armhole differently than we approached our neckline. So coming back over here, what we're going to do is we're going to do it from in between the layers. So instead of being able to just put our lining and our shell right sides together and stitch them, we are going to have to do this in two separate stitches. We're going to do from shoulder to side seam on the front and then shoulder to side seam on the back. And we're going to do it from in between the layers. Okay. So like I said, this is probably the most like confusing, complicated technique that we will do all semester. So if you need help with this, I definitely suggest coming to my office hours tomorrow, and trying to get some help with this, or scheduling a Zoom meeting if that's your option. Okay, so on the front, we're going to do the front half first. I'm only going to do one armhole today in class to save time, but you'll do the same technique to both. So one armhole at a time, just doing the front. This is my front bodice. This is the lining of my front right here. I'm going to stick my hand in between, so I should be able to see seam allowances. Stick my hand in between. Come over here, you should be able to see your hand in between those two layers. What we're going to do is tuck these seam allowances in. So right where that single notch is, I'm going to turn this seam allowance in so that I can pinch it with my fingers. So this is my thumb right here. This is my forefinger. Pinching that, and then same with the other one. Turn it in so that I can pinch it. So now you can see they're already right sides together. Right sides are touching each other here. So right at that single notch, turn both of those in so that you're pinching it. And then you're going to pull that bodice back so that you pull it through those layers. So it's going in between. So I'll do that whole process one more time. Front, go in between the lining of the front. So again, you should be able to see seam allowances. In between those layers, at that single notch, turn it in so you can pinch it in between your thumb and your forefinger. And then same with your facing layer, turn it in so you can pinch those two. Pull it out and kind of flip. Don't let go because you'll lose your spot. So now if you see where I was pinching those, they're already starting to go right sides together because of the way that I pinched it. So right there at that notch, without letting anything go, kind of flatten out that area so that you've got those two layers of fabric right sides together. If you accidentally let your spot go where you were pinching, then it's going to be much harder to get back to it. If that happens, just start back over, turn it right side out, and put your hand up in there again and pinch it again. Okay, so I'm going to work. This is my side seam. So from that notch, I'm going to pin down to my side seam, and then I'm going to go from that notch up to my shoulder seam. So pin those right sides together. And then you can see my seam allowances are kind of tucked in here. You're going to have to pull them out and flatten them to each other. So work my way up from this pin. Matching those right sides together. The shoulder is going to be the tightest area because you're working in that small gap. We have maybe a 3-inch gap here that we're working within. So that's why it's going to be the tightest to pull that out. Okay, so keep pulling that fabric out until you're able to get all the way up to your shoulder seam and match those shoulder seams right on top of each other. So here's my two seams, one right on top of the other for the shoulder. I'm going to throw one more pin in here for good measure. Okay, so now it's going to look a little crazy, but what we're worried about is this curve here from side seam up to shoulder. We've got that pinned and right sides together. The rest of it's going to look like a bunched up mess. That's okay. Don't pay attention to that. As long as you've got these right sides together and they're nice and, flat, touching each other so you can stitch. Okay, so coming over here, I'm going to start at that shoulder, or you can start at the side seam and work your way up, whichever makes you more comfortable. But you're going to start at one of those seams. Got it here. Again, the shoulder is going to be the tightest one to get to. So I usually like to start there and work my way towards the easier part. Put my needle right down on that seam, and then
Again, I'm just worried about this edge, making sure that it's nice and flat right in front of my foot. The rest of this is going to be kind of bunched up for now. A really good thing to do on this is make sure that your needle is always down when you stop, because it's so tight and you may have to adjust your fabric a lot and kind of tug and pull on your fabric. If your needle is not down, it's easy to accidentally pull your fabric out from underneath the foot or to just lose your spot. So I would always try and, every time you stop, make sure your needle is down in the fabric. And some of your machines may have a setting to where you can choose that as a preference. So, so check out your manual and see if that's a preference. Every time you stop sewing, it's either needle up or needle down. So change that setting. And if your machine doesn't have that setting, then you can just manually put your needle down into the fabric with that wheel that's on the right-hand side of your machine. Just manually put your needle down into the fabric every time you stop so you don't lose your spot as you adjust. My seam allowance right here, you see how it was getting folded over and it wasn't busted open. So good thing I checked that. You want to make sure that stays busted open. Okay, so that's the front. Let's head back and we'll do the back.
Okay, so here's my front seam that I just did here. I'm going to trim my threads before I unfold my fabric. Okay, and then once I do that, I can turn this right side out again so that everything is right side out. And now you should see right here where we've got that armhole stitched at the front side. Now we need to do the same to the back. So I'm going to flip it to the back. Again, stick my hand. So this is my back shell and lining. Stick my hand in between those layers. I should see it come up through that hole. Right where that double notch is, fold the fabric in so that I can pinch it together, right sides together, pull it through, and then start pinning. So right at that double notch, pin it together, and then work your way out to the side seam. So this is my side, I think my side seam here, and then my shoulder seam on the other side. And you should see your stitches where you ended that front. Okay, for my shoulder, pull those out. Match those up and stitch. Okay, so just like we did the other side, we're going to go stitch that at 1/4 inch along that back part of the armhole.
Okay, so in this case, I'm starting down at the side seam and working my way up to the shoulder. And that's just because that's where my pins are sticking. I want them to stick out to the right. But you can do either. You can work your way from the shoulder down or the side seam up. And I'm connecting my stitches to that back stitch where I ended the front. Needle is always down when I stop so that I can adjust my fabric when I need to. then again, connect your stitches. There we go. Okay, back to our ironing board again.
Trim up your threads before you move on. And then just like we did to the neckline, we need to treat this like a facing because it is a facing. So we're going to trim, clip, and press and understitch. So on my facing side, I'm going to trim that facing seam allowance in half. So I trimmed this back side as far as I could. It's now into that, this is the tube I was telling you about. That's my shoulder area. So that's the tube that will never turn right side out if you do, if you had these right sides together as a full loop. Okay, so now I'm gonna do the back side. So I'm gonna pull it out, flip over to the back and just pull that seam out of that tube area to where I can see it. And continue trimming on this other side. Okay, now clip. Again, this is a pretty steep curve, so your clips should be pretty close together. Mine are about 1/4 or 3/8 inch apart. Okay, now we need to separate them and press. So here at the side seam, it'll be much easier to separate and get a ham in there. So you can see that's my armhole inside there. So I'm going to separate those at the side seam. That's where I like to start pressing because that's going to be the easier, more open area. So stick my ham in there with those separated. And then just like we did for the neckline, start pressing those over to that facing side. Oops, see my little side seam got a little bit tucked over. Wasn't fully busted open. And then when you get to that shoulder area, see if you can see my tube that I'm talking about. It's like this opening. So it's going to be a little bit harder as you go in there. Sorry, my camera switched angles. But as you get closer to that shoulder area, it's just going to be a little bit harder to get your iron in there. So you're going to have to use the very tip of your iron where it's narrow to get up in there. And you can try and pull it out. Once it's off the ham, you can kind of try and pull out that tube area as well. So I've got everything pressed except for the very top of the shoulder, which is in here. I'm going to take it off my ham. I'm going to turn that tube right side out or inside out, whichever way you look at it. And this part, I'm just gonna have to press on the table because my iron won't get all the way up in there when that ham is there. Okay, so now with it separated like this, I'm going to go back to my side seam. So this is right at the side seam. I'm going to keep it separated and I'm going to put that on my machine and I'm going to do it in 2 separate stitches for the understitch. I'm going to work from the side seam up to the shoulder on one side and then flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. So let's go do that. I've got at the side seam, I've got my 2 layers separated. I'm going to put that lining on there so that the arm of my machine fills out that armhole. So this is my armhole wrapping around the arm of my machine. Okay, and I've got bodice and lining separate. Okay, so let's zoom back in and we'll get this stitch. So working from side seam up to shoulder on one side, I'm stitching right on top of those seam allowances so they stay folded over. And you should be stitching them with them pressed towards the facing. Working my way up to this shoulder. This is my shoulder right here. Back stitch there and stop. Pull it off of your machine. Get it all unstuck. And then go back to your side seam. It's still separated. You should be able to see your understitch on one side. We're just going to flip that around so that they're sitting on opposite sides. And now I'm going to put my bodice on the machine, just like we did. Let that machine arm fill it out. Press those seam allowances over to the facing side. And we're going to stitch that one down. And you can see with my pointer finger here, I'm just keeping those seam allowances down as I feed them under my foot. And then again, I'm just working my way up to that shoulder and connecting to my previous stitches. Okay, take that off. Last thing we're gonna go do is press this and we'll be done. Okay, so trim those threads before you move on. Any threads that you have hanging off. Now look at my shoulder that's inside this tube. I don't think I have any there. Okay, now flip everything right side out. And now you should have a fully stitched neck hole and a fully stitched armhole. And we just need to press that armhole and we'll be done. And again, you would do these same steps for your other armhole for your notebook. I want you, I know that seems like a lot, but I want you to practice this more than once because we're doing this on our dress and we need to master this skill before we go to put it into a full garment. So you would do the exact same thing starting over, stitch the front, then stitch the back, go and then go back, trim, clip, press, and understitch the front and understitch the back in separate steps for that other armhole. Okay, I'm gonna stick my hand up or my ham up into my armhole. And just like we did for the neckline, I'm going to make sure that seam is right on the edge and press. Are there any questions about this process? Okay. So you'll see as you're going and doing all of this, your garment gets a little wrinkled. So make sure once you've got all of that pressed that you do some maintenance pressing. So all of this, you can see I've got all these wrinkles from turning everything inside out and right side out. So now I would just press this, make it look really nice and neat and professional before I photograph it for my notebook.